that investigative journalism particularly plays in that accountability space for monies that were apportioned mostly to Uganda for mostly to African countries rather for COVID-19. We have our speakers for today. Solomon Serwanja, who is the Executive Director for the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. We have Mr. Hopewell Chinono, who is an award-winning journalist and a documentary filmmaker. We have Holly Van Wyk, who is an investigative journalist with Daily Mavericks investigative team. And we'll have Andrew Mwenda, who is from Uganda, a founder for the independent newspaper. We'll also be joined by Grace Kenganzi, who speaks for the Center for Health, Human Rights and Advocacy, CEHAD. And we will also have Sisi Kagaba, who speaks for the ACCU, Anti-Corruption Coalition of Uganda. So I'm just making sure that we have all our speakers and we can get the show on the road. I see that John Allan Namu from the African Census has joined the space. I wait for him to become a speaker. All right. Let's start off with Solomon Serwanja, who is the director for the African Institute for Investigative Journalism, under whose umbrella we are convening today. Solomon Serwanja, if you could start us off. First of all, what's AIIJ and why the interest, particularly in investigating monies that were given to Africa for COVID-19?
So thank you very much, Raymond. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Solomon Serwanja, who is the team leader here at the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, world. So the African Institute for Investigative Journalism is a home and a center of excellence for investigative journalism. We particularly support investigative journalists in a number of ways. We provide training and capacity building. We have the grant making program where we give out small grants to investigative reporters. We as well do investigations ourselves at the Institute and also promote accountability and promote collaborations between different investigative journalists working on different projects. But perhaps at a later time, I'll tell you more about the Institute. I thought that I could give some introduction on this Twitter space. There have been many countries across the African continent that have been struggling with corruption since the COVID-19 pandemic. Different stories have been written across the continent of inflated prices. We have money that is not accounted for. And in a way, it has affected Africa's fight against the pandemic. And so we're here to discuss how corruption is actually affecting the fight against the pandemic, but also most importantly, the role of investigative journalists in exposing these evils so that we don't have a replica of those. So today we'll be hearing from different speakers from all over the continent to make a contribution and to remind ourselves that as journalists, we have a role to play in promoting public resource accountability. Thank you very much, Raymond.
All right. Thank you so much, Solomon, for setting the groundwork there for what we'll have as a discussion today. I want to start with John Allan Namu in Nairobi. Nairobi is one of the places where the first investigation into COVID-19 money and its accountability came out of, and particularly on how government had been using money that was meant for the COVID-19 response. John Allan, first, give us a Kenyan perspective. What exactly happened in Nairobi, Kenya, around COVID-19 monies that were borrowed by the Kenyan government towards the COVID-19 response?
Well, thanks a lot, Ray and Solomon and everybody at AIIJ for having this discussion. I think it's really important. What happened with the money is still an open question. What seems to have taken place is that a lot of the money that was dedicated for the COVID-19 response, at least in the initial phases of such procurement of things like personal protective equipment and the staffing, as well as the support for frontline healthcare workers and setting up of COVID field hospitals and such, a lot of it seems to have gone down that very familiar rabbit hole that we know here in Kenya and perhaps across Africa in terms of budgeted corruption, so to speak, where people who had connections to agencies that were essentially the ones who are seeking these kinds of procurements then would walk in. I mean, there have been lots of headlines in Nairobi about people walking into the Kenya, into various agencies and walking out with tenders worth millions of shillings. The second thing is over and above the grants that were given, there were also donations that were made by various corporate bodies, individuals. There has been very little in terms of a response with respect to how that money has been accounted for. That's why I'm saying that it's still a bit of an open question as to how some of that money was used and how some of that money was appropriated. I think to be able to understand why this is still an open question, you kind of have to look at the superstructure of procurement, public procurement in Kenya, and some of the gaps and that were created, some of the gaps that exist that get you to understand why corruption is such a serious issue when it comes to healthcare generally, but COVID-19 in specific. So with public procurement being set up in such a way that there's fairly opaque, there's a lot of opaqueness in terms of who gets what contracts, how budgets are given out, whether the people who are getting contracts to supply or to procure various services are in fact doing so as a matter or are beneficiaries of conflicts of interest. Those are all questions that we kind of need to ask ourselves here. And then how does more open governance help in the fight against public procurement-led corruption? So in broad strokes, that's kind of where we are in terms of where money went for COVID-19.
All right. Thank you so much, John Allan, for that context. I want to cross all the way and go to South Africa to Polly. Polly, a lot of the lack of accountability may not actually mean that the money was siphoned, but in South Africa's case, we're not just looking at lack of accountability, we're actually looking at money meant for COVID-19 that was actually tendered out to companies that didn't supply the services. And we've had commissions of inquiry in South Africa. Talk to us about the South African context. What exactly happened with COVID-19 monies in South Africa?
Good afternoon and good day, world. Yes, indeed, South Africa was not left out of the complete orgy of corruption that struck struck the continent. So I have two very clear examples for you of how our COVID funds were stolen and fleeced from the state. But I also have two excellent examples in that of investigative journalism and journalists shining a light on corruption and shining a light on the truth. The one would be our Minister of Health, and that was perhaps the most egregious example of corruption, but how our Minister of Health was involved in an 80 million, at least 80 million rand spin-off where a company named Digital Vibes, run by the friends of our Health Minister, Zweli Mkhize, got contracts from the health department and the state to ensure that they assist the minister in all things communication relating to the COVID situation. That 80 million rand seems to be an ever-growing number, and my colleague Peter Louis Meiberg at Daily Maverick has investigated the matter and saw that the minister's son has opened a beauty salon and received a vehicle, and that money was sent to the minister's house for reparations. And as the deeper that Peter Louis Meiberg's investigation go, and the deeper he scratches, it seems that the more he reveals and the closer he comes to the minister himself. And one of the very egregious things that he unearthed was how the minister's PR intermediary, Digital Vibes, injected themselves between the minister and the state broadcaster, and charged the state broadcaster millions of rands in fees to let the minister speak there to the nation about COVID and about the problems in the country and the virus. And in South Africa, that is part of his job, to speak to the state broadcaster. His friends aren't supposed to derive benefit from it. So that was quite a massive scandal, highlighted by excellent journalism. And in the meantime, the minister was forced to resign. So if we talk about repercussions, that is also a good example of where journalism in South Africa and the continent really is a shining light. The second example I have for you is another colleague of mine, Mark Haywood. We investigated hundreds of millions of rand in terms of misused COVID funds used to disinfect schools. One was that 98 million rand for schools in Gauteng. It was just one case in nearly 350 million rand of larger fraud and misappropriation of COVID funds. And Mark Haywood, in doing that, also showed that Treasury's bookkeeping system failed, and that proper track of the money wasn't taken. So, in the effect of PPE corruption, or what we now call the personal protective equipment for frontline health workers, had a direct effect and a measurable effect on human lives in South Africa, because now our health department attempts to tell us that they have no budget to do a proper vaccine PR drive. And in South Africa, there's a big swell of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine sentiments that is not getting addressed because money was directed away from the health department towards the private pockets of politicians and business people.
All right. Thank you so much, Polly, for laying ground also on the South African, particularly the Digital Vibes scandal, which, of course, was highlighted by very impressive journalism. I want to cross over to Zimbabwe, who's your neighbor, Hopewell Chinono. Hopewell, your health minister, too, was sacked over corruption, over the COVID-19 accountability and how contracts were being dished out. What's been the case scenario for Zimbabwe on the utilization of COVID-19 funds?
Thank you very much for hosting this debate. It's very important for the continent, and I would like to say hello to everybody who's on the panel, including my good old friend John Alan Namo, and everyone who's listening. In Zimbabwe, it was a tragic case because we were not prepared at all for this pandemic. And I call it tragic because the whole idea of a government is to make sure that it protects its citizens. But in Zimbabwe, the government, immediately after the pandemic started, they were now focusing on how to loot the public funds that were earmarked for this pandemic. So we got hold of information that the funds were being looted and that they had set up a phony company called Drugs International. This Drugs International was set up specifically to loot public funds meant for COVID. So I got hold of a document which didn't make sense, and I started engaging the permanent secretary for the Republic of Zimbabwe on Twitter. And as I was engaging with him, he didn't realize that I actually the document. So when I said something, he said, "No, that's not true." And then when I said, "No, it's true, here's the document that you signed," he then disappeared. And I realized that something was amiss. There was a newspaper called Newsday that had published the story around this issue, but it didn't follow it up. And there were two other journalists who had sort of started writing the story. But what I then did was to investigate whether this company actually existed, where it said it was domiciled, which was the United Arab Emirates. So I checked on the company registry of United Arab Emirates, and it didn't exist. The address that it had used was a block of flats, which was a two-bedroom apartment. And I then checked where it said it was domiciled in Hungary, and it was a one-bedroom flat in a dilapidated one-bedroom flat in a very poor area of Hungary, where you would not expect a company that has entered into a multi-million-dollar business with the government to be domiciled. And as I continued with my investigations, I then realized, whilst talking to other journalists, and one of the key journalists who was involved in the investigations is a guy called Dudu Simatoli, who runs an outfit called Zim Live. And I discovered that there were actually very prominent people who were involved in linking up this company with the government of Zimbabwe, getting contracts and so forth. So as the issue unraveled, some of the investigations that were done by Mdudu then linked the president's children to this scandal. And the president's son issued a letter on a particular date saying that he had nothing to do with this company and that he didn't know the people that were involved. And the company itself, Drugs International, also issued a letter on the same day that the president's son issued a letter, which was issued via the president's spokesperson, Joe Charamba. So this company, when it issued the letter, its own rebuttal, I looked at the two letters and I did what's called text analysis. And then I realized that the letters had actually been written by the same person. And the fact that they had denied that they had no link to this person, pictures then emerged. The president's son with this guy in China and in other parts of the world. And when I challenged them with these pictures, the ruling party then rolled out a press conference where I was attacked in person, and I was told that myself and others should stop this. Needless to say, I was arrested 2 weeks later and thrown into prison for 45 days under the pretext that I was inciting violence. And yet what I was actually doing was reporting on the fact that there was a political activist who was coming up with an anti-corruption protest. Drugs was not the only company that was involved. There was another one called Jaji. It's run by a doctor based in Namibia, and again, pictures emerged of this doctor at two different occasions with the president of Zimbabwe. And when we challenged to understand the relationship between the president and this guy, again, stones were thrown at me. I was called names, a Western puppet, all sorts of things, the usual stuff that the government of Zimbabwe throws at you when you start unraveling what's happening. And I discovered documents, I got documents through my investigation that the ridiculousness of the looting of public funds for COVID was so bad that this company bought something from China for $350 and sold it to the government of Zimbabwe and billed it for 67,000 US dollars. That's how tragic it was. That's how rampant and rotten the looting had become. I then followed up with the Namibian government, the Minister of Finance, and I got documents from the Minister of Finance in Namibia showing that this particular company, Jaji, which was run by a Zimbabwean doctor based in Namibia, actually it never traded in since it was formed. It's just a shelf company. It has never paid tax. Again, I challenged the state, and I challenged the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, and nothing was done. And the tragedy became worse because at some point a video then emerged from ZBC, Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, which is the only television station in Zimbabwe controlled by the state, which had not been broadcast, but it was showing the president presenting this company as a donor, saying that this company was going to give 60 million US dollars, which was not correct. And when we challenged again the state, they did not respond. We were called names again. And the tragedy of this scandal is that they were selling, for instance, masks which were being bought for 65 cents, 65 US cents. They were selling them for 28 US dollars to the state. When I looked at Jaji, the Namibian company, the bank account details it had put, which were supposed to be a standard bank account in Namibia, did not actually exist. That account did not exist. When I challenged the state again to say, this account which you said you paid money into does not exist, how was the money paid? Again, we got no answers. I was arrested on the 20th of July, as everybody knows, and I spent about 45 days in prison. When I came out, I met some state security guys who said to me, "Well, you were arrested. We know that we don't have a solid case, but someone said you must be arrested to slow him down." And I was arrested again in November, again for exposing corruption involving the president's niece. The third time I was arrested in January for something I did not do, and they used a law that does not exist. Now, the impact of all these scandals is that up to now, people do not have the required PPEs in hospitals. Nurses and doctors are always complaining. Some even come to social media to complain about this. And recently, the Auditor General did another audit which showed that $89 million meant for COVID again had been looted. It was not accounted for. And then they said that the Minister of Health was trying to suppress that. This is an old story. I mean, John, who's been investigating stuff for over a decade, will tell you that this story is not unique. It's systematic looting of anything that has got money in it, and COVID was no different. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Hopewell. And that, I think, lays groundwork for us to get into the deeper parts of the conversation. I want to come to you, Andrew Mwenda. The story coming from Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe is not different from what happened in Uganda. And the question that I ask myself is, were the states in Africa not prepared already internally with systems to deal with procurement around COVID-19? Because a lot of the corruption seems to be emerging out of the fact that contracting for COVID-19 was either inflated, sent to friends, relatives, and brothers, or the delivery for COVID-19 equipment didn't come as expected. And we've had our own scenarios in Uganda. So, Andrew, in terms of a broader context in where this story of COVID-19, money and corruption falls, where would you locate it as an editor and a former investigative journalist yourself and a CEO of an investigative paper? Andrew, if you can unmute your microphone.
Yes, Raymond. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me, especially my great grandson, Solomon Serwanja, for inviting me to this discussion. Two, I want to express my sympathies with the journalists from Zimbabwe.
Yeah,
because I have been greatly disheartened by his story. Well, it is so shocking that he could be arrested over and over again. If his story is true, it is really disheartening. Well, first of all, I think that when you have a crisis like the one we had around COVID, what it normally does, it forces governments to stampede into a stampede to do things. You have to procure so many things of so much value in so short a time. In fact, for you to be effective in combating COVID, you have to suspend many of the rules and procedures and regulations of procurement in order to be efficient. But remember that once you remove those rules and procedures, then individuals with malign intentions can take advantage of the crisis to make money. And I would suggest that I don't think this is just in Africa. I am sure in countries like the United States, in Europe, where pharmaceutical companies hold sway, where the medical industry is politically powerful, there must have been a lot of shenanigans going on. So this is not unique to Africa. Perhaps the case of Zimbabwe and the arrest of this journalist may be unique because of its own detail, but I don't think it would do. I was shocked, but I was not surprised by the volume of corruption that I have just listened from other journalists. Please remember also that we need to understand corruption as investigative journalists. We need to understand corruption as not merely a mechanism through which individuals are able to exploit public resources for their personal gain, even though that is its most blatant expression. I personally think that corruption is the way in which political power, especially in our part of the world, in Africa here, is organized, how it is distributed, and how it is reproduced. In fact, I am afraid that if there were no corruption, I fear that these states could collapse. But COVID exhibited another thing, that when corruption becomes endemic, it can even threaten the very elites who indulge in it, as we have, of course, seen in countries like Sudan, northern Sudan, as in other countries like Guinea and Burkina Faso. When corruption gets out of hand, it can create what I would call social dynamite, and when there is a detonator, then you have a political explosion and the government's collapse. So what these guys have talked about is evident in Uganda. There was so much procurement. The Uganda government went on a spending binge. It is so difficult to find the accountability for that money. The Uganda government spent, they say, on COVID 6 trillion or 7 trillion. Raymond and Serwanja, you are Ugandan journalists on this program. Do you know where that money went?
They couldn't even account for over 500 billion shillings of it. So we don't know where the money is.
That is too small, because 600 billion would be about 9% of the total money they have spent, the 6 trillion. So whatever it is, COVID must have provided a classic opportunity for the powers that be to make money. I hope that in their making money, some public good was achieved.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew, for giving us good context for where the story happens. I want now to bring Grace Kengazi in the conversation. Grace Kengazi is the Media and Communications Officer for the Center
That uh, has put a burden on private citizens, where the government should be providing funds in public health facilities, things like PPEs, medical oxygen, vaccines. You find that we are fundraising. I mean, the Prime Minister asked us to collect money, and corporate companies collect money just to buy vaccines. So you find that this situation, because money has been misappropriated, the burden is on the citizens, private citizens, to pay for COVID management and treatment. What that means is that when they go to public hospitals, either the public hospitals health facilities are overwhelmed, and so they turn to private health facilities, which are expensive. We saw many media reports in mid-June when the cases were at their peak, where people were being charged as high as 100 million shillings for in COVID season treatment. And that's what happens when there is no money to facilitate health facilities in managing COVID-19. And so, from an advocacy point of view, it's the fact that when money is being misused, it's not just even the system that is being affected. It's even the people themselves. Someone who is suffering from COVID cannot afford to get treatment in a public facility, even when they're paying their taxes. Yes, government should be providing for them these services for free. So you find that many people have had to find their own solutions. We've had very many people medicating with concoctions. Even when someone came up with a treatment for COVID, it has been entangled in so many things, including concentrates and things like that. And all these are things that could have been solved had the money that was collected from 2020 had been planned for well and accounted for appropriately. So yeah, when corruption happens, that's what happens also. The healthcare system, the gaps in the healthcare system and the public healthcare system are revealed and they are glaring. And we should be ashamed of ourselves as a country because we're in the second year of COVID. So we should be planning better for the money that is collected. But on the other hand, instead of making sure that everyone gets vaccines, making sure that things like COVID reach everyone who is unwell, making sure that people are not paying exorbitant prices for COVID-19. Instead of doing all that, we are buying cars, apparently to transport vaccines, which vaccines we don't even have, or nor can we afford them. So yeah, that is the extent to which corruption has affected our healthcare system.
All right. Thank you so much, Grace, for that perspective. And I know that we've talked about how the COVID-19 corruption played out in South Africa and how it played out in Zimbabwe and Kenya. But on our own here in Uganda, there were real concerns about how COVID-19 money was used. And I want now to call Solomon Serwanza, because I know that a lot of this has been work that the African Institute for Investigative Journalism has been looking into. So Solomon, briefly help us understand, in a Ugandan perspective, how corruption manifested in this COVID-19 procurement.
I think what we saw in Uganda can be described as a money haste, a COVID-19 money haste, to say the least. We have seen huge sums of money, just disappearing in thin air. And I wanted to break it down for you, Raymond. Let me start off with the vaccination. This government, Parliament of Uganda, allocated about 18.5 billion shillings to procure vaccines during the first wave of the pandemic. What has happened is that we have had so many of the vaccines that have been coming through as donations. And I think it was really shaming when Matia Kasaija, who is the Minister for Finance, was interfacing with the Committee of Parliament alongside with the National Medical Stores Executive Director, that is Moses Kamavale, And the MPs asked him what happened to the money that we gave for procurement of vaccines. And the person responsible for procuring vaccines says, well, I didn't get that money. And the finance minister says, well, that money was actually sent to the Ministry of Health. And up to now, we don't know where that 18.5 billion shillings is. Meanwhile, we have allocated about 560 billion shillings to procure vaccines. What is very interesting is a special piece that was done by the Daily Monitor today, that there were conversations within the corridors of the Ministry of Health to procure vaccines at $10 rather than the $5.5 that COVAX is issuing. And so you see, a tendency of government officials wanting to benefit from the pandemic. Some corrupt and dodgy, government officials. Think about this. COVAX has already supplied to us about 1.7 million doses, right? Uganda wants to procure more vaccines. However, they want to give the contract to a private entity to procure the vaccines at $10 per vaccine. And so this was nipped in the bud. I think the Daily Monitor published one of its top stories. What an amazing example of what investigative journalism can do. I am very sure that government of Uganda cannot, and the vaccinations committee, which is called the VAC, which sits at Ministry of Health, was in closed door sessions debating, and I am happy that most likely they are going to recommend that we procure the vaccines from COVAX, the COVAX arrangement at $5.5, $5.5 per dose. Now, manifested itself in Uganda is we spent about 20.1 billion shillings to establish 20 isolation centers in each district around this country to do surveillance. But you'll be surprised that the report that was recently released by the Auditor General said that there was no single isolation center that existed. Think about that. 22.1 billion shillings goes missing, and it goes in thin air. This is a statement from the Auditor General's report, to say the least. Now, what actually is also interesting is that the Ministry of Health got money from international players, donations to say that, including from the World Bank. Some donations came through from, USAID and other entities that were supporting Uganda in the fight. What the Committee of Parliament in their report has revealed is that these people at the Ministry of Health, when you look at the accountability that they presented accountability of the same issue to money that was also given to them from the consolidated fund from government itself. So you find that they're giving accountability both to the donations, but also to the money that was given from the international players. And so there's all need to expose some of these issues. I think what also really blew my mind off is that the government procured a company, the Ministry of Health, to say the least, procured a company to supply 20 tents. That is tents to shelter people who had COVID at that time. We spent about 3.8 billion shillings to procure 20 tents. However, they only installed 13. Now, 13 tents out of 20. But also the 13 tents that they actually installed were weak and therefore could not provide shelter. In other words, we did not use the tents. And no one has come out to say the 3.8 billion shillings should be returned to the consolidated fund. And that was really happy. I mean, think about this. We spent 2.9 billion shillings to procure megaphones, the ones that we use to speak out. 2.9 billion to procure megaphones in this country. However, the Auditor General notes that by December, most of the districts had never received megaphones. And then what is most disturbing is that even when there are these reports from both the Parliamentary Accounts Committee or the committee that was set up to look into the expenditures of COVID-19, the Auditor General's report and the report from the Ministry of Finance into the COVID-19 expenditure I don't see any action done. I mean, we should start asking ourselves as investigative journalists, what can we do to put these people to account? Lest these are just going to remain reports that are going to gather dust on the floor or on the shelves of different ministries and accountability bodies. I think that as journalists, we have a role to use investigative journalism as a tool for advocacy, to really put out these investigations and name and shame the people who are corrupt so that they are brought to. I mean, if you just
But the one question that I want to ask you, Polly, is what's been the role of journalism in holding power to account? There's many theories, there's many schools of thought that think that newsrooms were largely unprepared to report around COVID-19 contracting, just as they were unprepared to report around the pandemic itself. Do you think that there were some misses that investigative journalism had during this period that allowed for massive corruption to happen across the continent?
Thank you. I firstly just want to say to my colleague from Zimbabwe, Hopewell Shinono, I just want to salute you as a brother in journalism. We in South Africa have so much regard for you and your bravery, and we stand with you, and we are proud to be journalists along with you. You may have followed it, but in South Africa there was an entire discussion about you and articles written about you, and your dogged pursuit of the truths that leaves me awestruck and which I regard as an amazing lesson in journalism. So I wish that you please contact me and my colleagues at Daily Maverick anytime if you need help or assistance. So, and what happened, I think, to our colleague Hopewell speaks to the question that you're asking me right now, is how power is likely to act when challenged, how power is likely to act in cases of emergency, and how power is likely to act when people are in need. And it's a shame that the continent's examples show us everything towards the negative, that it's rather toward throwing Hopewell in jail and stealing millions of USD if we want one unifying currency across the continent, as opposed to helping people and saving lives. And it seems to be a theme that we need to explore. And I'm interested to hear what my colleagues think the reason for this is exactly. And I think it speaks a lot to the point made by our colleague Solomon from Uganda just now. And in part, I would want to postulate that the lack of repercussions in South Africa and perhaps in the rest of our continent, and the absence of a culture of taking responsibility compacts the corruption problem beyond and above COVID-19. This is not a COVID-19 problem. COVID-19 perhaps just highlighted how callous and heartless politicians and power is, that not even in the face of a worldwide pandemic where people die and where there's a direct correlation between corruption and the lack of proper government and people dying, not even in the face of that could they man up or woman up and say, let's help our people and let's fight for our people, as opposed to fighting for our pockets. How how that is even humanly possible is beyond me. Now, I want to highlight again two examples of corruption in South Africa that I personally investigated, where it's not necessarily South Africans or even Africans coming to our country or my country to perpetrate the crime here, but where it's Western and Eastern companies coming here trying to corrupt and to steal and to fleece. I think South Africa in the past, looking broader than COVID, has lost its innocence in the arms scandal, where our former President Jacob Zuma was involved, and where it still haunts us to this day, mostly because the merits of that case has never been aired in a prosecutorial court. There's been much litigation, but the court case in terms of the charges, the criminal charges, has never been brought to an end. And that, I think, derives a lot of impunity and a massive lack of responsibility in our country. And it shows a way out. And in one way, I do think that democracy, a democratic system in South Africa, where democracies aren't well suited, perhaps, for people who are corrupt to the core and who feel no shame in just sorting themselves out, and people who wish to fleece even their neighbors from the little bit of money they have. Democracy do not have an answer for that, and I'm not sure, in the absence of a proper functioning legal system and an efficient, effective legal system, which we are struggling with in South Africa, how otherwise you're going to address those problems. So our problems with the legal system and the Hawks, which is our elite corruption fighting unit, and the police and our prosecuting authority, started with that case of the arms scandal involving former President Jacob Zuma. Now, what I investigated was two Western companies, Bain and Company from Boston and McKinsey, the consulting firms, coming here and in the first instance, breaking state institutions, which was SARS, our revenue service, and our state electricity company, Eskom, and another state-owned enterprise looking at transport infrastructure, which is called Transnet. So they, in the end, were just these Trojan horses that looked at the system and allowed a family, perhaps already well known in other parts of our continent, named the Guptas, and of course other local companies like Bosasa and so on, to fleece the state of billions of rand. And that is where you mentioned it earlier, where the Commission of Inquiry has its basis in, is to investigate this and in an attempt to offer us some solace and offer us a way forward in terms of repercussions. But if we speak about what repercussions look like and what responsibility and taking responsibility look like, McKinsey offered, based on an investigation I and Susan Comrie, a colleague of mine from Amabungani, did recently, in the past 3 years, on Eskom and Transnet, McKinsey offered to pay back 1.5 billion rand they took from Eskom and Transnet, after civil society stood up and addressed the matter as well, along with reading our reports. And I find, and I would love to hear what the rest of my colleagues say, but I do find that when civil society stands up based and stand on the shoulders of journalists and good investigative reports, it's much easier for a country to self-correct, perhaps, and to enforce responsibility and repercussions related to corruption than it is when journalists stand alone. So I'm looking forward to your views.
All right. Thank you so much, Polly. I want to also come to Hopewell again. Hopewell, in terms of internally as newsrooms and our capacity to investigate corruption, particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic. How prepared were newsrooms? And if they weren't, what kind of preparation would you have required as a journalist investigating corruption for a newsroom to have?
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Paula for those kind words. I think in Zimbabwe, newsrooms were not prepared at all, because the first thing that should have happened was for newsrooms to understand what PPE means, where these masks are being made, how much they cost to buy when you're buying them from factories. Newsrooms should have been prepared to understand the medical things that are going on around the pandemic, around COVID-19. In Zimbabwe, this was not there. In fact, the mainstream media stayed away from this story. I think one newspaper, which is the Newsday, did one or two articles, but the mainstream media stayed away from it. It was actually dealt with by myself and Duduthi Matutu. We were the two journalists that plowed into this story, and that ended up making so much noise about the looting of public funds meant for COVID. And secondly, I think we needed to understand how much had been set aside, how they had arrived to that decision to set aside such amounts of money, and also to understand why, for instance, a company in Namibia would be given a contract to supply masks in Zimbabwe when the Zimbabwean government itself, or the national company which is responsible for health consumables, could have gone and made sure that they bought these things. Journalists were not able to provide nuance to this. Journalists were not able to explain to citizens the relatedness of things from the corruption, and they were not even able to trace how the money was being moved around. The president came out and said this was a donation from this company called Drugs, which turned out to be a criminal enterprise, and still this was not followed up. The third thing is that when you look at this kind of corruption, it doesn't happen in isolation of state power. It doesn't happen in isolation of the ruling elites. There is no way outsiders would come and start looting public funds unless they've got a helping hand from within the state. I can tell you now that since these scandals started being exposed, nobody has been convicted. All the people that were involved in these scandals are walking free. In fact, we have got video, which we want to use in one of my court cases, of one of the guys who was responsible for drugs actually meeting and hanging around with people from the president's office, people who were supposed to be investigating him. These are the complications that we saw in Zimbabwe. And unfortunately, the media was not equipped to deal with these things. One of the primary reasons is that it's very easy for journalists to be pushed away from such stories because they earn very little and they are given backhanders and bangs. They take money and they don't do the stories. I don't know in other parts of the continent, but specifically in Zimbabwe, the story was not actually covered properly. It became a big international story through my arrest. The international media started to understand what was going on when I was arrested, because I had been warned, as I said 2 weeks earlier, by the spokesperson for the ruling party, ZANU-PF, that I should not talk about the president's children, even though the context required me to talk about them. But this in itself shows you that the elites were involved, and then the elites were supposed to be, were going to be protected. The Minister of Health, who was fired after we continued pushing out evidence of what was happening, and the president was left with no option but to fire him, is working today. He has not been convicted. I've been to prison 3 times. This guy actually did not even, he got free bail, uncontested bail. And it's a tragedy because so many people, so many Zimbabweans have died because of this looting of public funds. So many people who would have been alive today, including medical doctors, nurses, and other health professionals, if they had been given proper PPEs, you would find pictures of Zimbabwean nurses wrapping around blankets in order to protect themselves from COVID-19 infection. And that's unacceptable. And I also think that it's important that in terms of pandemic, at least from my personal observation is that in terms of pandemics, the African bodies must take over. The African Union should take over, because if they leave independent states to do whatever they want, we'll end up with a situation that we saw like in Uganda, where unsuspecting citizens were injected water. They thought that they were getting vaccinated, but they were injected water. So if states are allowed to have that kind of sovereignty where they do whatever they want, it ends up in a situation where we are today, where funds are looted. And a pandemic is dangerous in the sense that one country can look after itself, but unless everyone else has looked after themselves properly, as we have seen with different variants, we will continuously have this problem unresolved. And if Zimbabwe fails to do its work properly on this pandemic, regardless of whatever South Africa does, South Africans will also suffer the problems authored in Zimbabwe, because our people move across borders. So I think it's something that we need to reflect on, and I think it's something that the African Union needs to reflect on.
All right. Thank you so much, Hopewell. Andrew, I want to come back to you, particularly about the infrastructure in the newsroom to investigate broad corruption in African states, and using the example of Uganda. Just before the pandemic, actually, the contracting around the pandemic started, a lot of newsrooms were struggling with their financial models because the lockdown had affected how much consumer power there was on newspapers and magazines, and even programs that were being put out by journalism. Do you think that journalism needed to be better prepared, or do you think that something different needed to have been done by newsrooms during the COVID-19 pandemic to be able to have institutional measures that would investigate corruption at a grand scale like the state? Andrew, you'd have to unmute your microphone. We have trouble getting through to Andrew. Let me just move over to Solomon, because I know that African Institute for Investigative Journalism has a training and capacity building program, but also has a collaborative reporting program for investigative journalists across Africa. What gaps have you seen in this COVID-19 pandemic, particularly around the institutional infrastructure in the newsroom, that you think need to be addressed so that it can rise to the task of investigating corruption around the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, thanks very much, Raymond. I think that the first thing is the very media houses are working. Now, remember, they were also suffering from the effects of the pandemic. And so they were looking at every available resources that would come through advertising. And so we saw, media houses in different African countries really getting scared to bite a hand with them. For example, if the Ministry of Health is implicated in a scandal, you will find that I've seen very many stories die in several newsrooms because, you cannot do an investigation that is going to make a certain person look bad, for example, because the person who is giving you money. explore and investigate stories. And this is where I think civil society needs to come in my view, to support investigative stories, as well as, development partners to, put funding and get interested in looking at investigative journalism as proof advocacy. I mean, at the African Institute for Investigative Journalism, we are trying to mobilize enough resources to support independent journalism with small grants and funding. We have seen several journalists complaining that they would love to do a particular story, but they don't have funding. So I think as a continent, we need to explore the different funding models available to support investigative journalism. The other thing I think is that corruption in itself is changing faces. It is no longer how it used to be. If you're investigating illicit financial flows, you need to have a certain skill set because it's not out there. I mean, you have to dig deeper. For people like Hopewell and Pauline, they know exactly what I'm talking about, that you need to get a skill set. You need to use open source investigations. You need to, dig deeper and get this information out for you to be able to put out a good investigation. I think that we need to pay deliberate attention to training journalists into this, equipping them with this skill, learning from the very best the investigative journalists on this core. Clearly must have a deliberate move of, extending their skill set to other journalists to take particular attention to some of the investigations. So I think skill is very important for investigative reporters, but as well as exploring different funding models. And those have really been very, very key challenges in the newsrooms in terms of pushing for accountability, Raymond.
All right, thank you, Solomon. Polly, if you could come in, Solomon suggests the role that civil society and the massive funds at their disposal, particularly in accountability, putting that money towards investigative journalism. How would we do that in a creative way that maintains the ethics of the reporting and also makes sure that the agenda of the civil society is questioned in the stories that are being told?
That is such an excellent question, and it's a question that South Africa has grappled with for quite a long time. And I work in such a unit that is publicly funded. And the unit that I mentioned earlier, which incidentally trained me and trained a lot of Africans as well, Amabungani, works on the same basis. So I am in Skopje, the investigative journalist unit of Daily Maverick, and we have a hybrid fund or a hybrid funding model which stands on the shoulders of public funding, where we have a loyalty program of Maverick insiders, and they fund us either monthly or quarterly or annually in tranches as they see fit, from as little as 75 rand up to whatever they feel they can achieve. And from this, we try to garner a sense of loyalty and a sense of working towards the country. These people assist us and fund us because we're not behind a paywall, and we're trying to use that as a selling point, saying that we want to stay open and free for all people in South Africa and the world, and especially in the continent, to read us, but we cannot do that without our people's help. So we have a lot of people funding us, and then we receive funding from the more traditional advertising model, as do most journalism units, and we receive money from events that we could host pre-COVID and post-COVID. One day soon, hopefully, we will be able to do that again. So that is one way, but integrity will always be the question. And I must say we really are doing well in that regard, because our funders are just so much. They are also many. They are literally the man and the woman on the street. So it's difficult for people to say, well, you received this big amount of money from that company, or from this business person or that benefactor, and because of that, you are shielding them from any responsibility or from any repercussions. So it helps when you throw it open, and there are so many people in South Africa that support you. An additional point to make, perhaps, is that speaking of training journalists to understand health issues and newsrooms, South Africa is blessed with an excellent health-focused unit, Becky Sisa, who already had an excellent background relating to HIV reporting. And we did really well. We as South Africans and South African journalists did really well in terms of reporting on COVID because we already have a strong health sector and a strong health reporting and units in our newsrooms. The rest of the newsrooms who weren't as well prepared wised up very quickly because we had a lot of experts in the country who were willing to help. Now, if we speak towards repercussions, the Minister of Health was forced to resign, which was a big and important point for us to note. But with that helps, and that obviously goes towards the point where we say to people, we need your funding and we need your help to remain excellent journalists and to remain independent and to ensure that there are effects from our reporting. So it's a difficult point to navigate and a difficult model to initiate, but at the moment it does pay for Daily Maverick.
Thank you so much, Polly. Grace, I want you to get back on the call because you are in advocacy, and Sehad occasionally works with investigative journalists to be able to expose areas around sexual and reproductive health in that space and investigating in that space. Do you think that the money that you have at your disposal as Sehad could, in a way, enable investigative journalists execute the role of exposing corruption in areas where you do your advocacy? And would you be willing to give away that money without strings attached or with no conditionalities on how the money should be used, so that it can enable the journalists to maintain their ethics in telling stories?
Thank you, Raymond. First, I'll start with saying that I have no power at all to say what money can be given. But what I am sure of the at Shahad, we are committed to working with investigative journalists to help them, in their work in revealing different gaps when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights services. And indeed we have had media fellowships in the past with the African Institute for Investigative Journalism, where we train 15 journalists on this. And I cannot say there are strings attached away from expecting them to go out and use the information that we had provided in informing them on the different sexual and reproductive health and rights service gaps that we had identified in the country, and just opening their minds to the fact that these things are happening, and giving them an idea of pictures on what kind of stories they can explore. So that is as far as we work with them. I wouldn't say that any strings attached. The only string is the expectation of a product, which is an investigative story. But usually let them, we give them leeway to work within their ethics, because we cannot ask them to go out and investigate something and then we put strings, then we'll be contradicting ourselves. But yes, we are committed to supporting investigative journalists in ensuring that our healthcare system is improved, especially up to the last person who is the patient who walks into a public health facility. Sehad, we want to see social justice in health for all, where everyone can access affordable healthcare, and I am very confident in the power of journalism for us to achieve this.
All right. Thank you so much, Grace. We're going to open this up